He ruled Harlem like a king, feared by gangsters and respected by politicians, but the truth about Bumpy Johnson is far deeper than legend ever told. Ellsworth Raymond. Bumpy Johnson was more than just a gangster. He was a man shaped by survival, power, betrayal, and the impossible fight of being both a criminal and a community hero. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy got his nickname early due to a bump on the back of his head. But what really defined him was his sharp mind and sharper tongue. Growing up in the Jim Crow South, Bumpy knew that the world didn't offer much to black boys like him. When his older brother got into trouble with a white man and was nearly lynched, Bumpy's parents sent him north to Harlem. That decision would place him in the center of one of the most powerful criminal legacies in American history. The young Bumpy, who arrived in Harlem in the early 1920s, was just a teenager, but he carried the weight of Southern trauma and the burning desire to never be powerless again. Harlem in the 1920s was electric. Jazz filled the air, the Cotton Club was jumping, and the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were creating art that would last forever. But beneath the glamour there was another world. A world of numbers runners, bootleggers, and hustlers who controlled the streets while white politicians controlled the laws. Bumpy didn't have connections. He didn't have money, but he had something more valuable: intelligence and the ability to read people's intentions before they even knew them themselves. He started hanging around the pool halls and barbershops, listening to conversations, learning who had power and who pretended to have it. He watched how the older criminals operated, how they moved money, how they settled disputes, and most importantly, how they survived in a world that wanted them dead or behind bars. His first real job was as a bodyguard for numbers runners. The numbers game was simple but profitable. People would bet on 3-digit numbers, hoping to hit the daily winning combination. The odds were terrible, but for people with little hope of getting rich any other way, it was a dream worth chasing. And the people who controlled those dreams made millions. Bumpy learned the business from the ground up, collecting bets, delivering payouts, and protecting the money from competitors and cops alike. But Bumpy wasn't content to stay in the background. He had bigger plans. By the late 1920s, he was working directly with the major players in Harlem's underworld. He proved himself reliable, smart, and ruthless when necessary. Unlike many young criminals who were flashy and reckless, Bumpy was calculating. He dressed well but not extravagant. He spoke softly but carried himself with unmistakable authority. People began to notice him, and more importantly, they began to respect him. In 1930s Harlem, opportunity came fast if you were smart, tough, and willing to break the rules. Bumpy was all three. He started small, running errands, doing collections, but he quickly made a name for himself. He could read people like a book, and he knew how to control a room with just a glance. By the late 1930s, Bumpy became the right-hand man to Stephanie St. Clair, known as the Queen of Numbers. St. Clair was a formidable woman who had built a numbers empire in Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s. She was French West Indian, educated, and absolutely fearless. She owned property, employed hundreds of people, and commanded respect from everyone in Harlem, from politicians to preachers to other criminals. When she chose Bumpy as her lieutenant, it was because she recognized something in him that others missed. He wasn't just muscle, he was a strategist. The numbers racket in Harlem wasn't just a game. It was a multi-million-dollar business, and St. Clair was the boss. Together, Bumpy and St. Clair protected their territory against the Italian Mafia, especially notorious mobster Dutch Schultz. When Schultz tried to muscle in on the Harlem numbers game, Bumpy fought back hard. The war between Harlem's black racketeers and Schultz's mob got bloody. People were gunned down in broad daylight, but Bumpy never blinked. The conflict with Dutch Schultz was more than just a business dispute. It was a racial war. Schultz believed that black criminals were inferior and that Harlem's numbers game was his for the taking. He brought violence to the streets, intimidating numbers runners, beating up collectors, and trying to force St. Clair and her organization out of business. But Schultz underestimated both St. Clair and Bumpy. They weren't just going to roll over. Bumpy organized the resistance. He recruited young men from the neighborhood, armed them, and taught them how to fight like soldiers rather than street thugs. He established safe houses, created communication networks, and planned counterattacks that hit Schultz's operations where they were most vulnerable. The war lasted for months, with shootouts in the streets, bombings of illegal gambling houses, and constant tension that made everyone in Harlem nervous. But Bumpy's real genius wasn't in the violence, it was in the politics. He understood that the war with Schultz wasn't just about territory, it was about respect, about whether black criminals would be allowed to control their own neighborhoods, or whether white organized crime would take over everything. He reached out to other black criminal organizations, building alliances that went beyond Harlem. He also cultivated relationships with corrupt police officers and politicians, people who could provide protection and information. After Schultz's death in 1935, a new power vacuum emerged. Lucky Luciano took over the Italian operations, and instead of fighting, Bumpy did the unexpected. He struck a deal. Unlike many who folded or died, Bumpy negotiated a peace between the Harlem numbers game and the Italian Mafia. It was bold, it was smart, and it made Bumpy powerful. He became the unofficial mayor of Harlem. The deal with Luciano was a masterpiece of criminal diplomacy. Rather than trying to destroy each other, they agreed to divide territories and share certain operations. The Italians would stay out of Harlem's numbers game, and Bumpy would respect their control of other rackets like loan sharking and labor racketeering. It was an arrangement that benefited both sides, but it also established Bumpy as an equal partner with the most powerful crime family in New York. This partnership gave Bumpy access to resources and connections that most black criminals could never dream of. He learned about sophisticated money laundering techniques, how to corrupt judges and prosecutors, and how to build criminal organizations that could survive police raids and government investigations. But he also maintained his independence. Unlike other criminals who became junior partners to the Italians, Bumpy kept control of his own operations and his own territory. But Bumpy wasn't just about money. He was complicated. He read Shakespeare, he quoted poetry, he helped poor families pay rent and sent kids to college. He hosted politicians and priests at his home, then turned around and ordered hits on his enemies. He protected Harlem from outsiders, but controlled it with an iron fist. People feared him, but they also loved him. In a neighborhood often forgotten by the government, Bumpy was law and order, and sometimes justice. His home on Sugar Hill became a gathering place for Harlem's elite. Writers, musicians, activists, and politicians would come to dinner parties where they would discuss literature, politics, and the future of Black America. Bumpy was well-read and articulate, able to hold his own in conversations about philosophy, history, and current events. He collected books, attended concerts, and supported local artists. To many people he seemed more like a successful businessman than a criminal, but the contradiction was always there. The same man who would quote Marcus Garvey and discuss the importance of black pride, would also order the beating of someone who crossed him. The same man who paid for children's school supplies would also flood the neighborhood with illegal gambling and drugs. Bumpy lived in a world where violence and generosity, cruelty and kindness, existed side by side. His charitable work was legendary in Harlem. During the Great Depression, when many families couldn't afford food or rent, Bumpy would quietly pay their bills. He funded scholarships for promising students, helped small businesses get started, and provided jobs for men who couldn't find work elsewhere. He understood that his power depended on the community's support, and he invested in that support consistently. But he also understood that power without enforcement was meaningless. When someone challenged his authority or threatened his operations, Bumpy's response was swift and decisive. He didn't believe in second chances for people who betrayed him, and he made sure that everyone in Harlem knew the consequences of crossing him. His reputation for violence was carefully cultivated and strategically used. His power grew, and so did the attention. FBI agents watched him. NYPD hated him, but Bumpy was careful. He avoided wiretaps. He never spoke too freely. His network of loyalty was deep, but even the smartest criminals make mistakes. In 1952, he was convicted of drug conspiracy and sent to Alcatraz. Even there, Bumpy made his mark. He studied law, read constantly, and kept in touch with Harlem. The federal case against Bumpy was built over several years of investigation. The government was determined to break up his organization and send a message to other black criminals who thought they could operate with impunity. They used informants, wiretaps, and surveillance to build a case that would stick. When Bumpy was finally arrested, it was front-page news in Harlem. Some people saw it as justice, others saw it as persecution. Alcatraz was supposed to be the end of Bumpy's story. The federal prison on the island in San Francisco Bay was designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in America. Al Capone had been there, Machine Gun Kelly had been there. It was a place where careers went to die, but Bumpy refused to let prison break him. He used his time to educate himself, reading law books and studying the legal system that had put him away. He also maintained his connections to Harlem. Through visitors, letters and carefully coded messages, he stayed informed about what was happening in his old neighborhood. He provided advice to his former associates, helped settle disputes, and continued to exert influence even from behind bars. Prison officials knew that Bumpy was still a power player, but they couldn't stop him from maintaining his network. During his time in Alcatraz, Bumpy also developed relationships with other high-profile inmates. He learned about different criminal organizations, studied their methods, and built connections that would prove valuable when he was released. He was respected by both black and white inmates, a rare achievement in a prison system that was deeply segregated. He was released in 1963, and Harlem had changed. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Drugs were everywhere. Crime was different now, more ruthless, less loyal. Bumpy tried to rebuild. He connected with Malcolm X. He supported the Nation of Islam. He even tried to go legit, opening restaurants and investing in legal businesses, but the streets never let him go. The Harlem that Bumpy returned to in 1963 was a different place from the one he had left 11 years earlier. The numbers game was still there, but it was being challenged by new forms of gambling and entertainment. More importantly, heroin had flooded the neighborhood. The drug trade was more profitable than anything Bumpy had ever been involved in, but it was also more destructive. Unlike the numbers game, which mostly took people's money, heroin destroyed lives, families and communities. Bumpy was conflicted about the drug trade. He understood the money involved, but he also saw what it was doing to the neighborhood he had spent his life protecting. Some of his former associates were getting rich selling heroin, while others were becoming addicted to it. The young men who used to work for him were now strung out and desperate. The community that had once supported him was being torn apart by addiction and violence. His relationship with Malcolm X was complex and significant. Malcolm represented the new generation of black leadership, articulate, educated, and uncompromising in his demands for racial justice. Bumpy saw in Malcolm someone who could speak for black people in ways that criminals never could. Malcolm saw in Bumpy a man who understood power and how to use it. They respected each other, even though they came from different worlds. Bumpy provided financial support to the Nation of Islam, and helped protect Malcolm X from when Malcolm was receiving death threats, Bumpy's men would sometimes provide security. When the Nation of Islam needed money for legal battles or community programs, Bumpy would quietly contribute. It was an unlikely partnership, but it reflected Bumpy's desire to be part of something bigger than crime. His attempts to go legitimate were partially successful. He opened a restaurant called Bumpy's Place, which became a popular gathering spot for Harlem's elite. He invested in real estate and other legal businesses. He tried to use his connections and reputation to build a legitimate empire, but the transition from criminal to businessman was difficult. His competitors didn't play by the same rules he was used to. Government regulators scrutinized his every move, and his criminal past made it hard to get loans, licenses and other necessities of legal business. More importantly, the younger generation of criminals didn't respect the old rule. They were more violent, more reckless, and less concerned with community relations. They saw Bumpy as an old man who was out of touch with the realities of the modern drug trade. Some of them challenged his authority directly, leading to conflicts that threatened to spiral out of control. The most significant challenge came from Frank Lucas, a young criminal from North Carolina, who had worked for Bumpy but had his own ambitions. Lucas was smart, ruthless, and willing to break the traditional rules of the drug trade. He bypassed the established supply chains, importing heroin directly from Southeast Asia. He used violence more freely than Bumpy ever had, and he was making more money than anyone in Harlem had ever seen. The relationship between Bumpy and Lucas was complicated. In some ways, Lucas was like a son to Bumpy. He had taught him the business, protected him from other criminals, and helped him build his own organization. But Lucas was also a threat to everything Bumpy had built. His methods were creating chaos in Harlem, attracting federal attention, and destroying the delicate balance that Bumpy had spent decades creating.
Bumpy tried to mentor Lucas, to teach him the importance of community relations and political connections. But Lucas was impatient and ambitious. He wanted to be the king of Harlem, and he wasn't willing to wait for Bumpy to step aside. The tension between them grew, and many people in Harlem wondered if it would eventually explode into violence. But Bumpy was getting older, and he was tired. The game had changed, and he wasn't sure he wanted to change with it. He had spent his entire adult life building and maintaining power, but the cost was becoming too high. His health was deteriorating, his old allies were dying or retiring, and the neighborhood he had fought to protect was being destroyed by the very crimes he had helped introduce. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of heart failure while eating in a Harlem diner. Just like that, no shootout, no betrayal, just a quiet end to a loud life. But his story didn't end there. His legend grew. Movies like American Gangster portrayed him as a mentor to heroin kingpin Frank Lucas. TV shows like Godfather of Harlem turned him into a hero, a rebel, a man fighting against racism and corruption. The circumstances of his death were almost anticlimactic. He was having lunch at Wells' restaurant on Lenox Avenue, a place he had eaten at hundreds of times before. He was talking with friends, probably discussing business or politics, when he suddenly collapsed. The heart attack was massive and quick. The man who had survived gang wars, federal prison and decades of criminal violence died peacefully in a restaurant booth. His funeral was one of the largest in Harlem's history. Thousands of people came to pay their respects, former associates, community leaders, politicians and ordinary residents who had been touched by his generosity or his violence. The funeral procession stretched for blocks, and the church service was standing room only. It was a testament to the complicated legacy he had left behind. But the truth is more complicated. Bumpy was a criminal. He profited from addiction and violence. Yet he also gave back. He protected his people when no one else would. He walked a line most couldn't. That line between power and poison, between hero and hustler. The years after his death saw the rise of Frank Lucas, and other criminals who used Bumpy's methods, but without his restraint or his community connection. The drug trade exploded in Harlem, bringing unprecedented violence and destruction. Many old-timers would later say that things were better when Bumpy was in charge, that he at least had rules and limits that the new generation ignored. His influence on popular culture has been enormous. Countless movies, TV shows, books and songs have referenced Bumpy Johnson, often portraying him as a Robin Hood figure, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. While there's some truth to this characterization, it also oversimplifies a man who was both more and less than the legend suggests. The real Bumpy Johnson was a product of his time and circumstances. He lived in an era when Black Americans had few opportunities for legitimate success, when the criminal justice system was openly racist, and when violence was often the only way to settle dispute. He made choices that were both pragmatic and destructive, generous and selfish, community-minded and criminal. His legacy lives in Harlem stories, in whispered respect from old-timers who remember when Bumpy ran the block. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't clean, but he mattered. And in a time when black men were told to stay silent, Bumpy spoke loudly with words, with money and with force. Today, as Harlem undergoes gentrification and transformation, the world that Bumpy Johnson knew is disappearing. The numbers game has been replaced by state lottery. The illegal gambling houses have been replaced by legal casinos. The community that once rallied around figures like Bumpy has been scattered by economic change and social mobility, but the questions his life raised remain relevant. What do we do when legitimate institutions fail us? How do we balance personal ambition with community responsibility? How do we judge people who do terrible things for understandable reasons? Bumpy Johnson's story doesn't provide easy answers, but it forces us to confront these difficult questions. He was a man who lived by his own rules in a world that gave him few choices. He was a criminal who built schools and a community leader who ordered murders. He was a product of American racism and a perpetrator of American violence. He was in the end a man who mattered in ways that are still being understood and debated today. Like, subscribe and share if Bumpy Johnson's true story opened your eyes to the man behind the